Men, Adam, and the gospel. How many of you have ever seen that picture before? Yeah, the evolutionists love to use this picture to convince us that we evolved from some ape-like creature over millions of years. And it's being very effective. In 2017, Gallup poll did a survey of Americans to find out their views on human origins. And they discovered that 38% hold to the biblical view, down from 47% in the past. Another 38% hold to theistic evolution. That is, that we did evolve from ape-like creatures, but God was mysteriously guiding the process behind the scenes. And then another 19% hold to an atheist view, which says God didn't have anything to do with it because there is no God. So I did the simple math and found that 57% of Americans believe that we evolved from an ape-like creature. Well, is that really sound thinking? I want to begin by answering another question, or letting someone else answer it. It's a short video that, it's actually a trailer that ran in the Natural History Museum in London for a number of years. And it features Sir David Attenborough, who is the voice.
I'm going to take you on a journey to discover who you really are and where you came from. But you're not just going to sit there listening to me. You're going to be part of the experience, and you'll be able to examine some of the evidence for evolution along the way.
If you have a look at your screens now, you can rotate the modern human skull, and you'll see the domed forehead, the small face, the small front teeth, and on the lower jaw, a chin.
If you keep looking through your screen, you will see Australopithecus afarensis, an extinct hominid who lived about 3 million years ago.
Deep sea anglers live at a depth in the ocean below 1,000 meters where there's no light, so they're living in total darkness. It was our fishy ancestors that first developed some of our most fundamental features: our skeleton, jaws, and 4 limbs.
Hold up your screen and look through it one last time. You'll see the tree that represents all of life, past and present. We started this film with a question: who do you think you are? And we can end it with an answer. You are, undoubtedly, like every other living thing on Earth, a member of one single family of life, descended from a common ancestor living thousands of millions of years ago.
There you have it. Your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather is a little tiny bacterium. Popped into existence in the primordial oceans about 3.5 billion years ago. That is scientific fact, according to the majority of scientists. And in that video, you saw the evolution tree of life. It was represented by those blue laser beams. A tree is the branch of hominid evolution. And the evolutionists believe that all of the chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, modern man, all of us, as well as Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon, Homo erectus, Homo ergaster, Australopithecines, these are all descended from a common ancestor, an ape-like creature. In contrast, creationists who have looked into this think that the orangutan is probably one kind of an ape. Chimps and gorillas and maybe Australopithecines are another kind of ape. But mankind would include all of us, as well as Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon, Homo erectus, Homo ergaster. Those are all true humans descended from Adam and Eve. So 2 different views for the origin and history of mankind and ape-like creatures. Now, it's important to understand that everybody has the same data. They have the same evidence. They have the same fossils, the same DNA, the same living creatures to study. Doesn't matter whether they're evolutionists or creationists, they have the same evidence to study. But the question is, which of those views fits the facts? And I want to begin by showing you something of what the evolutionists have to say, and then we're going to look at what the Bible has to say. Now, one of the first creatures on the evolutionary tree leading to man is Australopithecus. Australo meaning southern, Pithecus meaning ape. So these are the southern apes, and much of the evidence for the Australopithecines has come from East Africa, particularly Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania. And the most famous Australopithecine is Lucy. How many of you have ever heard of Lucy? Yeah, Lucy is more famous today than Eve. Donald Johanson was a PhD student at the University of Chicago. He and his team found the bones of Lucy in 1974. They were not laid out in a nice, neat, orderly fashion like this, but they found about 25% of the skeleton. And because of the symmetry of the body, they could reconstruct about 75%. Since then, other evolutionists have found other Australopithecine fossils, and so they now have hand bones and feet bones. So this is how Lucy has been pictured in the Natural History Museum in London. And I want you to notice that she has human hands, human feet, upright posture, just like you and I stand, but an ape-like face. There are even evolutionists who would say that that is a serious misrepresentation of the fossil evidence, and that the truth is she was a knuckle walker similar to a bonobo or pygmy chimp or gorilla, and that's the way that we have pictured her in our creation museum. Well, that's Lucy in London, but now I want to show you Lucy in St. Louis, because the St. Louis Zoo had a Lucy exhibit for many years, and that's Lucy in St. Louis. Now, she's got a little bit more hair, but she still has human hands, human feet, and upright posture, but an ape-like face. And look at that face. Do you see the whites of the eyes? Those are human eyes. Well, that's Lucy in London and Lucy in St. Louis, but the Chicago Field Museum also has a Lucy exhibit. That's Lucy in Chicago. Now, she's a little more robust, but she has heavier eyebrow ridges, but she still has human hands, human feet, upright posture, and an ape-like face. And then that's Lucy in a BBC television program in 2006. Her face is completely different from the other three, although she does have that unusual hairline. But that's because the BBC is in London and the Natural History Museum is in London, so they've got to kind of have those match. But then that's Lucy in Smithsonian Magazine and Lucy in Science, two of our leading science magazines. So it's just any way the artist wants. Famous evolutionist and an atheist, and he wrote a book entitled The Making of Mankind to explain to the general public where man came from. And in that book he said, we can now say that Australopithecines definitely walked upright. So is there any doubt in his mind about this? No, they definitely walked upright. Well, that was 1981. But in 1982, he was up in London speaking at the Royal Institution, a very famous science institute. And there was a reporter from the New Scientist magazine who went to the lecture. Now, the New Scientist is a weekly magazine published in Great Britain that summarizes the technical scientific literature for the general public so that we can stay informed on what's going on in science. And it is evolutionist in orientation. The reporter tells us, Leakey points out that paleontologists do not know whether Australopithecus walked upright. Nobody has yet found an associated skeleton with a skull, he says. Well, now that's interesting. I wonder how many who read the book read that article or were at the lecture. The article goes on to quote Leakey. I am staggered to believe that as little as a year ago, I made the statements that I made. Well, I'm pretty staggered too when I think about it. So said Richard Leakey before the elegant audience of a Royal Institution evening discourse last Friday. He had come to reveal that the conventional wisdom which he had so recently espoused in his BBC television series, The Making of Mankind, was probably wrong in a number of crucial areas. Now, you see, the BBC realized not enough people people have read or will read that book. So we have to make a documentary so more people will know what's in that book. But now Leakey tells us that he was probably wrong in a number of crucial areas, not little tiny insignificant points, crucial areas. I wonder how many people who read the book or watched the documentary were at the lecture to hear that. In particular, he now sees man's oldest ancestor as being considerably younger than the 15 to 20 million years he plumped for on television. How many TV viewers ever heard that? Leakey says that the basis on which paleontologists classify fossil apes and humans is misleading, and he would like to see an entirely fresh episode of classifying. Well, that was 1982. In 1986, an article appeared in Discover magazine, another leading American science magazine. And Pat Shipman is a paleontologist writing this. And the article begins this way. An extraordinary 2.5 million year old skull found in Kenya has overturned all previous notions of the course of early hominid evolution. We no longer know who gave rise to whom, perhaps not even how or when we came into being. So if I had $1 for every time I have read in the scientific literature that some discovery has overturned all their previous thinking about some aspect of evolution, I'd be a very wealthy man. These statements appear regularly in the scientific literature. But they found this skull, and now they don't know who gave rise to whom, when, or how we came into being. So it's really thrown a wrench in their system. Here's a chart from Donald Johanson, who found Lucy, and Timothy White, another leading American anthropologist. This is before they found the skull. And they had some questions before they got to Lucy's kind, but then they're very confident that some of Lucy's descendants went off into extinction. The others eventually evolved into man. They have that all figured out, except they do have a question about Neanderthals. And then they found that skull. And now they don't know who gave rise to whom, when, or how we came into being. Well, that article in Discover went on to summarize all the fossil evidence for Australopithecus up to 1986, and the article ended this way. The bottom line of all this is that a great deal of work needs to be done. It's a new era in paleoanthropology. The things we thought we understood reasonably well, we don't. No better argument can be made to support the time, trouble, and cost of fieldwork than this new skull. Like an earthquake, the new skull has reduced our nicely organized constructs to a rubble of awkward, sharp-edged new hypotheses. That's a scientific word for guess. It's a sure sign of scientific progress. Well, it is progress. It's progress when you find out that what you thought was true is wrong. That is progress, but they're not getting any closer to the truth. They're getting more confused, as I'm going to show you. Well, that was 1986. In 1994, Nova Television had a series of programs on human origins, and I want to show you a clip from the first program. It features Dr. Owen Lovejoy, who is another American paleontologist up at Kent State University in Ohio. And I want you to watch and listen to what he is doing to a plaster cast of Lucy's hip bones. And the voice narrating in the background is Donald Johanson, who found Lucy. So watch and listen.
This has caused the two bones, in fact, to fit together so well that they're in an anatomically impossible position.
The perfect fit was an illusion that made Lucy's hip bones seem to flare out like a chimp's. But all was not lost. Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape.
How did he know what that was?
He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster. He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died.
And how did he know what that was?
It was a tricky job, but after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
That's perfect.
As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
Well, of course it does. He ground it to look like ours. Now listen, if a creationist did that to the fossil evidence, or plaster cast to the fossil evidence, he'd be crucified. But an evolutionist does this. This is good science. No, this is manipulating the evidence to fit a preconceived idea. So you have all those different pictures of Lucy. None of them are accurate. She didn't walk upright. She wasn't our relative. That's something like Lucy. She's not our relative. Well, what about Neanderthal man? Well, the first Neanderthals were discovered in 1856 in the Neander Valley in Germany, and this is the way they were pictured. They were pretty robust, stooped in the shoulders, ape-like in the head, and not wearing very many clothes. Of course, the clothes are not preserved in the fossil record, so that's pure imagination. But they found more Neanderthal skeletons in different places in Europe and the Middle East and elsewhere, and there are now evolutionists who would say that if you dressed up Neanderthal in a coat and tie and a hat, and you put him in the Creation Museum or the Ark Encounter, nobody would take a second look. In fact, 25 years ago now, Time magazine had an article, The Changing Faces of Neanderthal, and they showed how Neanderthals have been represented over the years. So here you have 1873, Harper's Weekly, and he needs a haircut, but otherwise he could be an American Olympic athlete. But then in 1909, he's ape-like in the head, but human otherwise, and naked. In 1953, he's behaving like some humans, but he's ape-like in the head. Then in 1984, he needs a haircut and a shave, taught not to eat live frogs or mice, whatever he's got there in his hand, but he's human. Then in 1988, he's showing that he needs to go to the dentist, but he's human. But then CNN has him more ape-like in 2006. He's got a lot more hair in 2007, and he's perfectly human in Science Daily in 2008. The Neanderthal Museum in Germany for many years had a statue of the 1983 version and a picture of the 1909 version. And one evolutionist commenting on this said, "From his bestial 19th century persona to just another guy in a suit, Neanderthals have been pigeonholed according to the times." But like any good museum, I've been doing scientific observations during this lecture. Now, I've noticed that some of you have big noses, and I've been wondering, where you are on the evolutionary tree. Oh, that's ridiculous. Those are humans. There are probably people that look like that. Yes, but the Neanderthals, now they were primitive. They had primitive stone tools, primitive culture. That proves that they weren't fully human. No, it doesn't. When George Washington was president of the United States, living in the presidential palace in Philadelphia, with Persian rugs on the floor, fine china and cutlery, and a toilet in the house, living in the very same country at the very same time, were Native American Indians living in teepees with no Persian rugs on the floor, no fine china and cutlery, and no toilet in the teepee. And they were just as human as George Washington. And we have people today that in our Western arrogance we call primitive. People like the Aborigines of Australia. They're different from us. They have a different lifestyle, but they're fully human. They're Aborigine children who go off to Australian universities. And if you dropped me by helicopter into the forest where they live with just the clothes on my body, even though I have a university degree and a PhD, I'd probably be dead in 3 days. I'd eat some poisonous plant. I wouldn't know how to make a spear or a boomerang, and even if I did, I wouldn't know how to kill anything. So they're different from us, but they're fully human. Yes, but the Neanderthals lived in caves. That proves that they weren't fully human. No, it doesn't. In 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found on the west side of the Dead Sea in Israel. Copies of the Hebrew Old Testament and other ancient Jewish writings put in clay pots by a group of Jews called the Essenes, who were living out there just before and after the Tina Cave, just like Neanderthals buried their dead in caves. And Lot, Elijah, and David lived in a cave for a while. Well, now, why did they live in a cave? Well, because God told Lot to get out of Sodom, and so he went up into the mountains, into a cave. Elijah was running from King Ahab. David was on the assassins list of King Saul. And if you're running for your life, a cave is a really good place to hide. And we have cavemen today. Very famous one died just a few years ago. His name was Osama bin Laden. And why was he living in the caves of the mountains of Afghanistan, we are told? Because the necessities of life required it. Very smart man. The archaeological evidence that Neanderthals were 100% human is just overwhelming. They made sophisticated spears, needles, and stone tools. Now, a bird will use a piece of straw to get a bug out of a tree. An ape or a monkey might use a stick to get ants out of an anthill. An otter will use a rock to break open an oyster on its belly. But animals don't make tools. Only humans do that. They used makeup, made seashell jewelry, and painted art in caves. They hunted dolphins and seals. Humans are the only land creatures that do that. They dove for living sea mollusks. They used fire to cook food, made glue, and maybe ropes and nets. And they built homes from animal skins. Now, beavers will build dams. Ants will build high-rise anthills. Birds will build nests, but animals don't make homes from the skins of animals. Only humans do that. They made flutes from bear femurs, headdresses from feathers. They cared for their sick and did surgery. We can tell that because there are Neanderthal bones that were clearly cut or operated on and healed. They ceremonially buried their dead. They made and sailed boats. And they possessed the hyoid bone in the voice box, which scientists say is almost identical to modern humans. They had the species-associated gene FOXP2, and they interbred with modern humans. They had children with modern humans. A few years ago, I was speaking in California, and this man came up to me after I gave this lecture, something similar to it, and he said, "You've got to use me in your lecture in the future." I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Because I've had my DNA mapped and I am 3% Neanderthal." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, I'm from Lithuania." I've since learned that except for black Africans, all human beings have 1 to 3% Neanderthal DNA. So you're part Neanderthal, most of you. So am I. And Dave was not primitive. He worked for Google in technical support, so I'm sure he's a lot smarter than me. Well, there's a Christian leader, scientist, who's influenced a lot of Christians to believe in millions of years, and this is what his organization, Reasons to Believe, says about hominids, and particularly Neanderthals. Reasons to Believe biblical creation model identifies hominids, Neanderthals, Homo erectus, and others as animals created by God. These extraordinary creatures walked erect and possessed enough intelligence to assemble crude tools and even adopt some level of culture. The Reasons to Believe model maintains that hominids are not spiritual beings made in the image of God. RTB's model reserves this status exclusively for Adam and Eve and their descendants, modern humans. But that's not what science says. Science says the Neanderthals were human. And look at this reconstruction of a Neanderthal at the University of Zurich. Does she look subhuman to you? Does she look like an animal to you? No. The Neanderthals were fully human. And because of where we found their bones, we conclude that they are people who migrated from the Tower of Babel after Noah's flood. Well, the Australopithecines are not our relatives. The Neanderthals are our relatives. What about some other missing links that the evolutionists have brought forth? Well, Piltdown Man was discovered in 1912, and the Illustrated London News had a picture of what he looked like based on the evidence. It was a piece of jaw, 2 molar teeth, a canine tooth, and a piece of skull. And the confident interpretation by the Geological Society of London was, he's 500,000 to 1 million years old, and the bones leave no possible doubt but that they represent a man who must be regarded as affording us a link with our remote ancestors, the apes. No possible doubt. Well, the bones went into the Natural History Museum in London. There were other artistic representations, this one more ape-like. But there were scientists who said, we would like to look at those bones. And the Natural History Museum said, we'd be happy to show you plaster casts of the bones. They didn't let anybody actually look at the real bones for 40 years. Finally, in 1953, they let some scientists, they were actually evolutionists, look at those bones, and what they found was a deliberate hoax. The jawbone was from an orangutan. They estimated it died about 50 years earlier. The skull was human. They carbon dated it to be about 500 to 700 years old. The bones were artificially colored with chemicals to make them look old. And when they examined the teeth under the microscope, they could see file marks. They had been filed to make them look more human. And the evidence pointed to some of the leading British scientists involved in this hoax, but they were already dead. But think about that. How many people who read the article in 1912 lived to 1953 to find out it was a hoax? Then there was Nebraska Man. And the Illustrated London News had a picture of what he and his wife were doing when they lost the only bit of evidence that the scientists found, which was a single tooth. And from that tooth, they reconstructed the whole scene. Well, they kept digging there in Nebraska, and by 1927, they had found more fossil evidence. And in a technical article, not in a daily newspaper, using a technical scientific name, not Nebraska Man, they quietly announced, oops, we made a mistake. That wasn't an ape man. That was actually an extinct species of pig. So that's the real Nebraska Man. And I like to say this is a case where a pig made a monkey out of a man.